Shall we get started? Yeah? Okay. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, the Southeast Asia Working Group, SEAG, here at the University of Pennsylvania, would like to share our acknowledgement that the land on which our university stands is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenape people. We pay respect to Lenape peoples past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. SEAG is very pleased to have with us today Professor Indira Arumugam from the National University of Singapore. Professor Arumugam is an anthropologist who works in Tamil Nadu, South India, and among the Tamil diaspora in Singapore and Southeast Asia. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at her university in Singapore. Her research interests include ritual theories and practices, intimate economies of reproduction, play and pleasure, and popular Hinduism. Her writings on animal sacrifice, divine agency, monstrosity, and sacrality, rituals, the gift, and kingship have appeared in How, Journal of Ethnographic Theory, Social Anthropology, Anthropological Forum, Anthropology and Humanism, Material Religion, and Modern Asian Studies. She has an upcoming monograph titled Visceral Politics, Imaginaries of Power in South India, which we're all very much looking forward to read. Professor Arumugam's paper this morning is titled Periyachi, a Tamil mother, midwife goddess in the Singaporean diaspora. I requested Professor Arumugam to share her work on the fierce but benevolent Tamil goddess, whose role in the lives of many Singaporean Tamils is unique, given the history of the immigrant community, but also that of the modern Southeast Asian nation state. Her work is the first to think closely about what this means. Now, without further ado, I'd like to pass the screen over to Professor Arumugam. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming early in the morning and late at night for me. And thank you, Praveen, for inviting me as well. I am very pleased to be able to share my work with you. So I'm just going to share my screen. Forgotten how to use it. Let me try again. Okay, yes, now it's there. So my paper for today is entitled Periyachi, a Tamil mother, midwife goddess in the Singaporean diaspora. So this is a reflection on work that I've been doing for several years, attending these worship, being part of them, doing ethnographic fieldwork on the goddess herself. And so these are, after I've written several papers, I've started to think more deeply about her role and significance for Singaporeans. Yeah, so I'm going to start with the origin stories of Periyachi, right? And so Periyachi, the word itself, right? Her name means, Periya means big or elder, and Achi means mother, grandmother, matriarch, right? And so her origin stories, as is usual with a lot of Hindu stories and a lot of other myths and origin stories as well, are multiple, right? But one clear strand stands out. And so her story seems to begin in 1403 in Konditopu village, which is now incorporated into present-day Chennai, the capital of Tamil Nadu, right? So apparently at this point, King Vallalarajan, who was of the Pandyan dynasty, had his wife who was heavily pregnant. She's Queen Karkurali, right? And there are several theories or stories or swirling around as to how this came to be. Like, so at one point, some stories say that King Vallalarajan was exiled and from his throne and from his rightful position, and in despair he turned to banditry, and so he was, persecuting all those around him as well. At other points, there's a much more sympathetic reading of him as, an exiled king who was trying his best, right? At whatever the case may be, his wife was heavily pregnant, and this was a breech birth, so it was a very difficult birth. and he was looking for a very skilled midwife in order to deliver the baby. Apart from his situation as in and being exiled and everything, also the fact was that his baby itself had ominous prophecies surrounding the impending newborn, right? Some said, right, that if the baby ever touched the ground, the world would end, right? So it is a very ominous kind of thing. Others say that King Vallalarajan himself was very jealous of this very powerful baby, and he wanted to kill the baby as well. So lots of differing interpretations, right? But at the point of it is, this is a prophesied baby, right? So, and difficult labor requiring a skilled midwife. And so Periyachi offered herself and she was known as a skilled midwife, and she offered her services. And King Vallalarajan was very happy, and he was very thankful. But she insisted on immediate payment, right? After she'd done the service, she wanted immediate payment, right? And so, yes, they were able to, she was able to conduct the birth. Not only was she able to get the baby out of Queen Karkurali in a safe fashion, but she also held the baby in her hands throughout, so that it never ever touched the ground. And so the prophecy was that it would destroy the earth didn't come into being. But the point is that despite this stellar service, the king refused to pay her. He was recalcitrant. He didn't see anything wrong with it. And she got angry at this sort of, that his vow was broken. And so she attacked him, and she, trampled on him and stabbed him with her trident and killed him. And his wife, Queen Karkurali, who was trying to intervene also, she also punished by tearing open her abdomen. So you can see in the iconography all of this. You'll see that in the next slide. Right? So this tremendous amount of violence, this stabbing, this trampling, all this bloodied violence was ethicized as punishment for not keeping their word. So at one point he refused to pay her, so he didn't fulfill his vow. The other point also, there were stories that he himself, being jealous of the child, was trying to kill the child. And so Periyachi killed the royal couple because she was punishing them for their evil, but also she wanted to save the child as well. And so after she killed the parents, she adopted the child, who was called Siralan, and he became the first priest of her temple. Right? And in a lot of temples in Singapore, her popular iconography, there are other types of iconographies, which we'll come to towards the end, but one of her popular ones is this sort of, in the apotheosis of wrath, right? So you can see she's rendering divine punishment. She's trampling on the king. She's disemvoweling the queen. She's chewing their entrails, and at the same time holding the baby, the prophesied newborn, aloft, right? And so you can see in how she's pictured that she's a sacred wrath, right? She has bulging eyes, gaping mouth, protruding tongue, sharp canines, an array of weapons, right? And when I was a kid, when we had to go to Periyachi temples, the first thing your mom and your grandma and everything will tell you is that do not be scared of her. She looks scary, but she's good, right? So this iconography of wrath and anger and punishment and violence, brutal violence, was ethicized as punishment, and also that she only punished the evil, that she was a guardian goddess, right? This violent mien is to emphasize her role as a guardian goddess, right? And so, as I've just mentioned, ever since I was a kid, I have been going to Periyachi temples. I've been part of Periyachi worship. I've done and not systematically, but this was just part of my sort of growing up in Singapore. Periyachi was a big deal. Every month, every year in August, there would be Adi, a month dedicated to mother goddesses, and we would have Periyachi rituals throughout all the temples in Singapore. Every week they alternate Tuesdays or Fridays or Sundays, and all the temples would have worship dedicated to Periyachi. And in my family as well, some of the rituals that I'm talking about as domestic rituals in the latter half of the paper were also part and parcel of my growing up, right? But I didn't do any systematic fieldwork until I finished my PhD and came back to Singapore for my postdoc work, right? So this is when I started doing fieldwork in Singaporean temples, really systematically chronicling this Periyachi worship, Periyachi rituals. And as you know, since these rituals happen only once a year, it took me, I attended almost for 7 years, right, in order to try to grasp what these rituals are about. And then I also attended rituals in the households, right? And one of the most helpful things for me was that apart from this direct field work, my PhD work actually helped a lot because I encountered Periyachi in the village in Tamil Nadu. So my PhD work was in a village in central Tamil Nadu called Vadur, right? And Periyachi was on the margins. So she wasn't the focus of my thesis, but yet, you know, she would appear once in a while in terms of rituals and everything. So being able to compare the systematic fieldwork that I've done in the temples and the households with PhD fieldwork, prior fieldwork in the village, as well as personal experiences and family rituals, allowed me to compare depictions of Periyachi, right? And kind of get to grips with the multifaceted nature of this goddess, right? So what it allowed me to do was follow the goddess on her travels from her rural origins in rural Tamil Nadu, in the villages of Tamil Nadu, to her settlement among the urban diaspora in Singapore and Malaysia, right? And it also allowed me to follow her oscillations between temples and homes to arrive at the questions that I'm going to talk about, that have emerged, and I'm going to talk about in the next few slides, right? So one of the first things that I was really interested in was I noticed that in Tamil Nadu, where I did fieldwork, Periyachi wasn't a big deal, right? Nobody had a dedicated Periyachi worship to her. There was no month dedicated to her. She existed, but more on the margins rather than right at the center as she is in Tamil Nadu and in Singapore and Malaysia, right? So one of the aspects that sort of really stood out to me was Periyachi as a diasporic deity, right? What is the effect of overseas migration with her devotees when she came from Tamil Nadu to Singapore? And usually religions, or trying to understand religion, diasporic religions or religions, migratory religions, you tend to look at what happens to the congregation, the worshippers, and their rituals and all of that. So, but I was much more interested in what happened to the goddess herself, right? The sort of imagination of the goddess, right? How is she imagined in Tamil Nadu, and how is that different from how she's imagined in Singapore? So I wanted to look at the effect of overseas migration on the nature and force of highly specific, highly localized, even sort of provincial deities, right? What did migration do to their nature and their force? And I was also looking at how the constitution and ambience of their rituals, how did they change due to migration? So the question that I was grappling with is, what happens when a goddess from the rural hinterlands in Tamil Nadu moves to a cosmopolitan, thoroughly urban city, right? That was what I was dealing with. And was that even in Tamil Nadu, there is no sort of uniform depiction of Periyachi, right? Periyachi in the cities is quite a generic goddess, right? She's quite serene, she's Sanskritized, she's like any other sort of goddess, right? So when I went to a temple in Kanjipuram, the priest was telling me, oh, Periyachi, her name comes from Pechi. Pechi in Tamil means speech, right? So she's sort of being reformed into a goddess like Saraswati, dedicated to education, and if you wanted to speak well, and elocution, right? That's what she was dedicated. So you should worship her if you want your children to study well and speak well. So she's quite a generic, there's nothing really that special about her. But in the villages, right, continuously, I found that she was much more of a dependent goddess. She didn't really have this sort of outrightly spectacular and sort of independent existence as she did in Singapore that I was familiar with, right? So in villages, she's usually a tutelary deity, a guardian deity for kin groups like lineages or villagers or streets or these sorts of kin configurations. And you would have an annual sacrifice, and she would be part of that. You would dedicate to this. But this was very rare. Much more common was that she was an attendant to superior deities, right? So that would be like a Muniswarar or a Viranar, who are these superior, who are these tutelary deities to kin groups as well. And she would be one of the attendants or the guardians of these sorts of deities. So the sacrifice or whatever wasn't dedicated to her, but she would be given some of the offerings as well. She would be on the margins of this sort of cult. Another point where she appeared in rural Tamil Nadu was as a woman's goddess, right? And so, and these are some rituals that will be familiar to those in Singapore as well. So after birth, right, people would consult Periyachi to come and bless the newborn, to thank her for a safe birth. And more unusually, after a bout of one of these pox diseases, chicken pox, for example, right? You would, after the pox had gone away and you had gone through the purification period and all that, you would have a worship to Periyachi as well, to that, right? So and so she was attached to this sort of cult of pox diseases and sacred diseases as well. But one of the things that was very clear is that there was very simple or no representation of her. Like, unlike the iconography that I've showed you before, as an attendant to superior deity, it was just a stick stuck into the ground, and she would have some garlands draped around her, and that was Periyachi. That's it. There was no complex representation, right? There was also very rudimentary ritual syntax. It wasn't, complicated or like every month, a regular sort of worship. It wasn't a step-by-step type of choreographed kind of ritual. It was quite a rudimentary ritual syntax. And most importantly, it was unmediated worship in the sense that people could directly approach her. They didn't need a priest, or not, if not as a Brahmin priest, not even a local non-Brahmin priest. You could just approach her directly. It was sort of an immediate sort of worship, right? So in some ways, I have argued in other places that these kinds of simple or no representation or rudimentary ritual syntax actually allows deities to be free in some ways and travel much more than they would, right? They rather than be represented by humans, they represent themselves. They directly appear. There's a direct manifestation. They come, they choose when to come, when to go. They possess people that they choose. They appear in visions and dreams. So they interpose themselves in the world by their own accord, according to their own whims and will, right? And this, I suggested, is a sort of indication of divine agency, right? In the fact that through this immediate kind of possession of other people or direct manifestations, they are able to cause actions to happen in the material world. They are able to exert their will on the world. So there's a sort of divine agency that is occurring. Periyachi in Singapore, on the other hand, right? You encounter her in two places as well, in temples, in public, and in households, in domestic spheres, right? And so I'm going to focus on the temples at this stage, and I'll come to the domestic sphere later on. Periyachi in Singapore, as she is manifested in temples and in the public, it's a spectacular sort of worship that's tremendously distinct and complex sort of iconography attached to her. You can always say, this sort of disembowelment, this sort of chewing the entrails, stepping on the thing, and especially holding the baby in the hand, right? You can always identify Periyachi whether she holds a baby or not, right? This makes her very distinctive, not very generic goddess. She's not like any other goddess. It's very easy to identify her, right? And in temples, at least, she is part of male-led worship. So in the sense that the priests are male, the mediums are male, the people who construct her movable icons, these are male. Everyone is male. And women are largely sort of participants, lay participants, and they sort of worship, but little more than that, right? They don't take charge of any of the rituals and all that. Secondly, the rituals are spectacular. They take, there's a huge stage, and I don't want to go into too much detail at this point, because I've written about it elsewhere, and it can be quite complex, right? But the rituals themselves are spectacular. You can see from the decorations in terms of flowers, they try to evoke her rural roots, right, with trees and plants and fishtail palms and whatever. And the flowers to decorate her themselves come on SIA, as they told me, and Singapore Airlines, and it costs at more than 5,000 Singapore dollars, just the flowers alone, right? And there's a lot of effort expended to construct her, to represent her, to decorate her, right? And in many ways, she is tremendously institutionalized. It's a very regular sort of cult, right? There's icons which are specific, there are rituals that are complex and regularly performed, and there's a clearly identified clergy who act as the intermediary between people and Periyachi herself, right? So it is a very spectacular occasion in contrast to the very simple way in which she is encountered in rural Tamil Nadu. So, so my argument has sort of drawn inspiration from Joyce Laquiga, who's argued that who's looked at how deities are mediated by materials, and not just mediated, but actually constructed by materials, right? So in this picture, there's a construction of the movable icon of Periyachi, and you construct her out of flowers and sacred water, starting with the pot. The pot is the body, right? And then the flowers and ornaments and everything. So ornamentation is not simply decoration, but actually creation and constitution, right? Which is what Laquiga argues in her notion of material acts. This material acts to make the goddess present and creates her in itself. And as you can see, the creators are all men, right? So it's dominated by men. So they create her in this sort of movable icon. So my addition to this is that I've argued that ritual acts that they do allow her to be animated and allow people to communicate with her. So the ritual acts involve not just the construction of her, but also she's taken on a procession around the temple in this sort of movable icon. And she's borne by, again, a male god dancer or Samyadi, right? Or spirit medium. So he's like a priest come medium kind of thing. And he carries her aloft on the head and he dances her around the temple, right? So the dancing itself activates her, animates her, and makes her, vivifies her, makes her alive in the ritual itself, right? And along with that, right, there are also relational acts in the sense that people relate to her as a mother, most obviously, because she is an Amman. So Amman in Tamil means mother goddess, but it also means, it is derived from the word Amman Ana, one who has become a mother, right? So to become the mother is to become the goddess, right? And so these relational acts, in a sense, you react to her, you enter into a relationship with her as a mother, but surprisingly, you also enter and try to connect with her in other kinship forms as well. So a lot of people cherish her, are affectionate towards her, give her gifts. Towards the end of the regular, the Periyachi worship that occurs in August, right? Towards the end of it, the devotees give her gifts as though these are prestations. And prestations are like kinship gifts that you give during life crisis ceremonies, births, deaths, marriage, and all that. And it's usually given to daughters and sisters, right? And from her natal family gives the daughter and the sister gifts for her to enter into this new relationship as part of a new relationship. And it's to signify their support of her and also the affection of her, their emotion towards her. And I suggest that the relational acts such as gift giving that people relate to the goddess with also places her in a relationship as not just a mother. You don't give gifts to mother, but also as a sister or daughter, right? And you relate to her in these sorts of kinship forms as well. And by these sorts of acts, the material act, the ritual act, the relational act, yes, it makes this cult spectacular. It makes this worship, intimate and immediate. It makes this something to be observed. But at the same time, it has several other effects as well. So I'm arguing, and so this is the priest carrying the movable icon that is made out of flowers around, dancing her around the temple, right? So I've argued that migration and this sort of spectacular ritual cult that has followed from this has, yes, drawn her into networks of kinship, networks of emotion, networks of affection, but has also immobilized what had been free and fluid forces. Has immobilized what had been free and fluid forces. In rural Tamil Nadu, because of the rudimentary syntax and lack of representation, she's free to come and go as and when she wishes, right? because of the much more sort of ritualization and materialization that is available or apparent in Singapore, she is dependent on human interlocutors in order to, or human intentions and actions in order to be represented, in order to move around the temple. She has to be born, right? Or in order to be present in many ways. So what had been a free and fluid force becomes largely mobilized in terms of within architecture, within a building, within icons, only able to move when you are riding when you are taken around by another human, right? And so this, I suggest, has a sort of, her willful autonomy as she had been before is sort of muted in Singapore. It's moderated in Singapore. She becomes much more dependent on human representations and rituals, and less autonomous or agentic in many ways. And one of the ways in which this is complicated is that sometimes, despite all these male efforts to represent her, to communicate with her, to vivify her, to move her around the temple, even during these sorts of rituals, somebody would become possessed organically, spontaneously by the goddess, and they'll start dancing, and people will move around and try to move away from her and try to, treat her with respect and everything. And this sort of some spontaneous possession can be seen as something that the goddess herself chooses who to present it. And these spontaneous possessions tend to be usually only of women, right? Despite all these spectacular, complex, intricate cult and representations, when she does choose to possess someone, it usually tends to be a woman. But this is much more rare. These sort of choreographed rituals are much more prominent, right? So I argue that in some ways, a subject, a sovereign in many ways, in charge of her own territory, able to maneuver on her own, able to exert her will and her force on the universe, is rendered into a much more stationary and contingent object, dependent on icons, dependent on mediation. So, I mean, this question, which I haven't come to an answer yet, right? So in India, she's, at home, she moves around, she appears in dreams, people encounter her when in their everyday life, right? But in Singapore, it's very rare to hear these sorts of stories, right? So I suggest that because she's so entwined with her ecology, where she came from, her roots, her rural roots, the sort of ecology, this village, this botany, all of those kinds of relationships. When you take her out of that ecology and put her somewhere else, right? Does she actually feel at home? So yes, she has come with her devotees, she has migrated with her worshippers, and she has settled in Singapore. But does migrant settlement in Singapore, is the migrant settlement of Singapore actually home? Does she feel at home here? And this is something that I'm, maybe she doesn't move around and doesn't spontaneously, appear and act on will, because she doesn't really feel at home here. I mean, this is something that I'm still grappling with and trying to answer. Right? So one of the key sort of questions emerging from my fieldwork, as I've said, is on migration and the effect of migration on the force of deities. And the second question is about gender, right? So I'm trying to understand the difference that gender makes to the imagining, the framing, and the approach to specific deities and rituals. So specifically, because of her associations with proto-obstetrics, with midwifery, with fertility, she's always been framed as a mother or a midwife goddess. And she's primarily of and for women, right? Women approach her when they want to get pregnant, when they are pregnant, when they've given birth, for the safety and the health of their children. So she's primarily in everyday life a goddess primarily of and for women. But what happens when she's appropriated by male priests and mediums and sort of ensconced in temple architecture and elaborate rituals, right? What happens at that point? And does gender make a difference with this? So now we come to the second part. So worship of Periyachi in Singapore takes two forms, right? So one is the temple public male-centered worship. And the second one is much, much rarer. And it's something that you only encounter as part of, close kin or or neighbors or friends, right? So you have to be invited to these. And I've attended several of them as a child, as a young woman, and much more rare today, precisely because Singapore has a declining birth rate and way below replacement levels. And therefore, these sorts of rituals that happen after a child is born are much more scarce and difficult to access. So this domestic worship, again, there's a sort of ritual sort of syntax, but it's not a very complex one. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but there are two aspects that are key. One is the feast offering or parayal that is offered to Periyachi. And this is the parayal that they're offering. The parayal means the feast and the offering of the food to Periyachi. And the second one is protection rituals, which we'll come to later. So this domestic worship of Periyachi takes place on the 16th or 30th day after the birth of the child, right? And so it's organized by women. So the child's mother, the child's grandmother, all the kin. So you can see all these people surrounding her, surrounding the kid are all women. They come together and they stage a worship. One of the things that is very important are the food items that are offered to her, right? So feast that is offered to her. And it involves rice, as you can tell. And it involves really very specific items, again, which sort of render her quite a specific and distinct goddess, right? Not a generic one in many cases. She's always offered chicken curry. In fact, there is a recipe called Periyachi chicken curry, right? And this chicken curry has to be made from a chicken, which is a sort of veteran egg layer, which has been exhausted by egg laying, right? So it's an old hen. And best is if the egg sac is still intact, right? So the chicken curry is very important. Then you have the hard-boiled eggs. Then you have dried fish. Then you have sauteed moringa leaves, which again rarely make a appearance in these sort of feast offerings, except for Periyachi. And then you have sweet dumplings and oil and lamps made out of sweet dough into which oil is poured and it is lit. So it's called a mavilakku, right? So these are sort of offerings. But the point to note is these are meat offerings, right? So the symbolism there you can already tell in the food itself, right? So old hen, egg sac, hard-boiled eggs. These are all symbols of fertility and successful sort of reproduction in many ways. And the things like dried fish and moringa leaves, moringa leaves especially are known to be high in iron, right? So they're supposed to give strength to the new mother, supposed to imbue her with nutrients that she has lost in the process of giving birth. So the symbolism is there in the food itself, right? Fertility, strength, recuperation, and post-birth recuperation. And this is a sort of thanksgiving to Periyachi. This is a feast that is offered as a sort of thanksgiving to her for her successful birth, for the health of the child, for successfully having reproduced. So that's an offering towards her. As you can tell, there is no representation of Periyachi. She's represented in the lamp that you can see that's there, right? So there's no sort of complex iconography or anything else. She's just represented through a lamp. So the second part of this domestic worship are protection rituals. These are protection because the birth is an especially vulnerable time, as we all know. And so these are protection rituals for the health of the mother, but especially the newborn, right? So a lot of a complex series of rituals take place, which are aimed at fortifying the child against the evil eye, against indigestion, against evil spirits, to protect him and her from all of this. So one of the key aspects is they put a lot of ornaments on the child. And the ornaments are armored with Periyachi's blessing. So they put bangles, they put waistbands, they put anklets, they put beads, necklaces, everything. So the child is dressed up in all of this ornamentation. And again, ornamentation is not just decoration. In this case, it is like protection, right? And protection that is further enhanced through the invocation of Periyachi's blessings into that. So for the child to grow and not to fall ill and thrive, that's what it is. And the other aspect is that you fortify it through invoking Periyachi's protection. So you imbue that in the ornaments. but also you invite Periyachi to be the foster mother to the child. So you're almost, I mean, like a mother-child relationship is a dyad, right? Through this ritual, you are inviting Periyachi to be another mother, a much more powerful mother, right? And to take care of the child and act as a mother and make sure the child, especially in its vulnerable early years, is protected and is able to grow and thrive. So you're sharing motherhood with Periyachi in some ways, right? And so this photo is like after this domestic worship, they take Periyachi to the temple. So you go to an Amman temple and you place the baby in front of Periyachi, right? And nowadays the temples have provided a cradle so you can place the child. And the important thing is you place the child, the baby, in front of Periyachi, then you move away, you retreat, right? And you allow her to take charge of the child. So in this way, you're relinquishing your absolute and exclusive rights to the child and inviting Periyachi in to be also protect the child and be involved in mothering the child as well, right? And this before the child turns 1 or something like that, you have to dedicate the child to Periyachi in the temple as well. So the reason why I worked on this domestic ritual is that I didn't find any other literature on this, right? And I didn't find anyone else who had written about it. But more importantly, and this was such a shock to me, was that men were not included or even allowed into the worship, right? So it would take place in a room where the baby was sleeping, and they would ask all the men to sit outside. Even little boys and little children, infants, male infants, were excluded. They couldn't participate in the worship. They couldn't even watch the worship, right? All males were excluded, right? And not only could they not participate in the worship, even more surprising, they could not even eat the food that is dedicated to the goddess, right? All the food that they had would be unconsecrated food that is sitting outside outside the room where the worship was taking place. So they could not participate. In Hindu worship, you make offerings, then the deity is supposed to sort of consume the offerings, and then you consume the leftovers. And the leftovers have been rendered rendered sacred because they include the grace of the gods, right? So to eat the leftovers from worship is considered to be allowed to participate in the grace of these gods, to have their blessings. But men were excluded from this. And I found this tremendously interesting because this is one of the few rituals in which men were completely, thoroughly, expressly, explicitly, repeatedly excluded, right? So when little boys would wander in, the mothers and the grandmothers would say, no, go outside, boys cannot watch, right? So they'll make them come out. So in many ways, this was one of the few Hindu rituals that I have encountered or I was familiar with, which was strictly women-led and women-centered. The officiants are women, the organizers are women, the ritual specialists are women, the participants are women. Everything centers around the women and only women. Okay, having women-centered, but it also excludes men. And more importantly, what was of concern here were all women's concerns with birth, with fertility, with children's health, right? It was all centered on this. So this allowed me to sort of engage with this worship as a sort of understanding of a sort of sacred maternity, or the goddess herself as a fierce maternity writ large, and how through these domestic rituals, ordinary women were trying to find some affinity or form some affinity or kinship with Periyachi to sort of empower and amplify women's inherent capacities, their own inherent capacity to fertility, for reproduction, for childcare, for all of that, right? And having the Periyachi be by their side, empowering and amplifying their own inherent capacities. And so this was surprising because even in the temple worship, not only were the priests males, the spirit mediums male, but also the main worshipper was even male. So this is again, this is considered this is part of the temple worship of Periyachi, and this is the ritual priest guises himself as Madurai Veeran, her chief and her foremost devotee. and she carries the goddess in the form of fire. So in the previous one, we saw her being carried in the form of flowers. In this case, in the form of fire. But even, as I said, what role women are given in this temple worship as simply as worshippers. But the most significant worshipper is again a male, Madurai Veeran in this case, right? And so this sort of contradictions and juxtapositions between a woman of and for women, a goddess of and for women, and largely concerned with women's issues, being sort of incorporated into and reshaped when she becomes part of male-led, male-centered sort of temple rituals, right? So I found these fertility, especially these domestic fertility rituals, to be a sort of gender or feminine sort of sacrifice, right? And so this question has always, because one of my abiding interests is on animal sacrificial worship, because I tend to work on lineages and tutelary sacrifices. So I was wondering, because in lineage sacrifices, women are excluded as well. So can women sacrifice, and do women sacrifice? And I found this Periyachi worship as an example of women-led and women sort of centered sacrifice, right? So, and I was only to arrive at this conclusion because I had previously done fieldwork on lineage sacrifices, animal sacrifices by males, right? In Tamil Nadu. And I found them to be male-led and male-centered, obviously, right? So all of these rituals, logistics, everything was done by males. But more than that, there was a symbolic exclusion or marginalization of women, in the sense that women could not even watch these sacrifices. You had to stand far, far away, so much so that you can't even see the deities. You can't even approach the deities. So my father's lineage deity, for example, Veeranar, even though I am a daughter of that lineage, I can't even see. I have to stand for it. My husband, who's like sort of alliance and comes through, like he's an outsider technically, right? He can go close, but me, because of my gender, I cannot go close and I cannot watch a sacrifice. But as other sort of tutelary sacrifices, they made an exception for the anthropologist, who's almost like half male anyway. So all the women would stand far away because they were quite scared of being possessed or smitten by those. And I would go closer and closer and closer, so much so that even my spectacles became speckled with blood, because I was so fascinated analytically by these sort of happenings, right? And not only do they exclude and marginalize women, there is a symbolic denigration of women within the rituals themselves. So there's an argument made by Isabel Clark Desai, for example, where that at these sort of lineage sacrifices, tutelary sacrifices, it is women who are the scapegoats. It is women who are symbolically sacrificed. Because in many ways, such lineage sacrifices are the appropriation of biological reproductive capacities that women, by nature and visibly give birth and reproduce, right? And so this is an appropriation of women's capacities through ritual. So in a lineage sacrifice, men ask for children from their tutelary gods, and they promise goats or sheep, goats or roosters, and they kill them in order. So this reproduction becomes a sort of alliance between males and their tutelary gods, thoroughly excluding women and not recognizing the actual biological reproduction. So ritual in sort of in ritual sacrifices in many ways are sort of counterfactuals, right? And they go against the grain of actual reproduction to center a male-centered understanding of reproduction. So rather than penis envy, this lineage sacrifices can be seen in some ways as womb envy. The sort of inability for men to create biologically allows them, ritual allows them to appropriate these sorts of biological reproductive capacities and create through ritual. But in that sense, women being present and is a sort of, they shouldn't be there. It sort of undermines your counterfactual rituals. And therefore, this is the reason they are either excluded, marginalized, or symbolically denigrated, right? So these are readings from many anthropologists who have looked at lineage sacrifices or tutelary sacrifices. And so Periyachi worship I found to be quite a contrast to that, right? So that it is woman-led, it is women-centered, and it excludes and ignores men. It doesn't even bother to denigrate them or symbolically sacrifice them or any of them. It just simply ignores them. as being trivial to the process of reproduction and caregiving, right? And so reproduction, rather than being rooted in an alliance between tutelary deities and male members, is seen as something which is, the role based on women's bodies, blood, sacrifice, and labors, right? So in many ways, this is a very immanent way of looking at reproduction. So while lineage sacrifices try to transcend the body, try to transcend biology, try to transcend nature, and try to impose a sort of eternal life, right? And don't want to recognize biological life because in some ways that involves death and decay, right? So they want to posit this sense of eternity. They have to transcend the material and the body, right? While for women's sacrifices or Periyachi worship, reproduction is rooted completely and thoroughly and very explicitly in women's bodies and labors, right? And so they attribute reproduction and caregiving to women, and they sort of amplify the roles in these sorts of rituals, right? At the same time, they don't try to really escape the body. There is an acknowledgement of the vulnerability, the fragility, and the failures of the body, right? Because this is why they have so many protection rituals. They know the child can fall sick. They know the mother can fall sick, that, it can lead to stillbirth, right? There's a space made for infertile women or those who have suffered miscarriages to approach Periyachi and ask for her blessings for successful reproduction. So there's an acknowledgement of failure. There's an acknowledgement of the vulnerability of the body, the infertility within fertility rituals, right? So in some ways, this ritual, rather than trying to transcend or exclude or marginalize, amplifies women's natural capacities. That's what I've been arguing in a sort of gendered means of looking at sacrifice. But I don't want to sort of descend into some biological determinism type of argument, right? So these depictions of Periyachi as an old woman are much more common in Malaysia than they are in Singapore. Again, you can see the child, right? That she's holding the child, Siralan, in so many ways. Yet she's in the guise of a very, very old woman. So it's a sort of complicated notion of womanhood. It's not just women equals reproduction, children, fertility, and all of that, right? In some ways, it's beyond biological determinism, right? Because Periyachi always appears, sometimes appears in its elderly postmenopausal form, where she can't give birth. She's not this fertile woman who can bear children, right? So she, what is valued is her skill as a midwife. And the older you are, the more births you have overseen, the more skillful you are, right? So this speaks to her skill as a midwife, right? And the second thing to remember is Periyachi herself has never given birth. She has become a mother, Amman Ana, Amman, but that's because she has adopted the child that she sort of tore away from the womb of Queen Kargurali, right? All she has is foster children. She has, even though she blesses births and she blesses pregnancy and all of that and fertility, she herself has never been a mother. She's always a foster mother. And within Periyachi worship, especially in the temples in Singapore, and especially in one temple, there's a huge prominence of trans women. And trans women are a significant part of these rituals, and they give her gifts, and they sort of take a prominent part in the temple worship in many ways. And trans women, as we all know, cannot reproduce biologically as well. But they can foster, they can adopt, they can become mothers, just like Periyachi can. So in some ways, they are the epitome of Periyachi in the sense that they are midwives. Trans women in popular Hinduism are seen as conduits of fertility as well. They can bless you for your reproductive efforts. And they are seen, so though they themselves cannot reproduce, they can bless your efforts to reproduce, right? So this sort of midwifery, helping birth, right, is a role of trans women in many ways. And this is the role that they share with Periyachi. So these sort of complications of a very simplistic biological determinism and equating that as womanhood is also something that I found very interesting. So I'm quite interested in looking at how women themselves constitute and define womanhood from their own perspective through intimate rituals and their everyday theologies. How do their popular rituals, how do their everyday, very simple sacrifices, very simple rituals allow them to see themselves as women and define what is womanhood and see what are their capacities as women. So I'm going to end very soon. So the reason I was really very interested in Periyachi in many ways, because she is by now she is a Singaporean goddess, a Singaporean Malaysian goddess. She is a diasporic goddess. She doesn't have a big cult in Tamil Nadu. She doesn't have prominent worship. Not many people approach her directly and in as spectacular a fashion as they do so in Singapore and Malaysia. So I'm interested in looking at a distinctly Singaporean Hinduism and how is that different from, how is that deviated from Hinduism in Tamil Nadu, for example, and how has migration paved the way for that, right? So I don't always want to look to India as a sort of template or as how it should be or model, right? How has Singaporeans themselves been able to evolve a distinctive form of Hinduism that answers or addresses their concerns, their specific concerns, right? So obviously they arrived in Singapore at a time where the maternal mortality rate and the child death rate due to pregnancy and all of that was very, very high. This is why she was such a popular goddess, because birth was dangerous, right? Birth itself, and you cannot guarantee successful childbirth. That's why there's a midwife goddess in many ways, right? So why and how have Singaporeans and Malaysians sort of preserved that, while in the so-called motherland, her importance has waned in many ways. And so I see these rituals to her as a sort of living heritage, right? As a sort of distillation of when devotees migrated, when Tamils migrated from Tamil Nadu to Singapore, what they have preserved, what they have left, what they have kept, what they have changed, what have they transformed, what have they evolved. And so I find that to be quite interesting. And I'm interested in mining rituals for history, for specific memories, for movements, for popular histories, for popular stories, right? And this is all part of my sort of overall thrust towards trying to understand religion, or trying to understand specifically Hinduism from ordinary people, from their everyday sacraments, the rituals that they do every day, the sort of improvised and intimate theologies that they have carved for themselves, and based on the ecology that they have moved into, based on their conditions, based on their concerns that they have interested in. And I'm very interested in looking, I'm not interested in transcendence in many ways, right? I'm very interested in a very immanent form of Hinduism, with concerns that are of the everyday, intimate, material, right? And so rather than sort of transcending materiality, right, I'm always interested in looking at religion, and specifically Hinduism, within the frameworks of materiality. And several people, Joyce Blackwig, for example, is a great inspiration in this. Like, how is materiality such an important aspect of understanding, experiencing, and explaining Hinduism? And the other thing I'm very, really interested in, one of the things that made me quite interested in Periyachi worship, was the fact that meat is offered to her. And meat, sacrifice, all of these are abiding concerns of mine, with meat as a form through which to communicate with and eat with and eat after the goddesses. And I think this is part of my attempt to sort of project or propose a very earthly, and even more importantly, an earthy Hinduism. And I think this is a sort of ethical consideration for me as well, given what is happening in India and this strive towards a singular, highly vegetarian, highly elitist version of Hinduism. So I'm interested in this plurality and plasticity. And I think, given that Hindus have been around in Singapore and Malaysia for more than 100 years, it's about time we looked at how the distinctive configurations and forms of Hinduism in India, and see what in Singapore and Malaysia, and what that has to offer to our understandings of popular Hinduism in general. Right. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Indira. Great talk. There's a lot of information there. It's very detailed research. Thank you. There are a bunch of us in the room. There is professors, scholars who work on the region, who work on goddess worship in the Tamil South, scholars who work in Southeast Asia. But before I ask them if they have questions, can I start with a question? So my question is about caste and Periyachi worship. So what does Periyachi worship do for caste for the Tamil diaspora in Southeast Asia? Because the worship of gods and goddesses, village gods and goddesses, are determined more so by one's caste community and what community one belongs to. Or is this different in the case of the goddess Periyachi? Yeah.
I think it's much more complicated than that, because in this case, caste convenes with kinship. So a lot of this domestic worship of Periyachi, for example, is amongst very closely grandmothers, neighbors, and all of that, right? In Singapore, I think it is expanded, so it can include neighbors and friends as well. Right? But you're very right in pointing out this village god, especially you can see meat is a huge important aspect of worship towards her. And therefore, caste, definitely. She is not an elite. But I'm not interested in the elite god. I think enough, and many people much more skilled than me have come to grapple with all of these Sanskritic gods, and they know what they're talking about, right? And I don't really know. So I'm much more interested in these lesser known, lesser talked about, and nevertheless highly significant gods for very, very distinct communities. And I mean, my approach to Periyachi was not from the point of view of caste or whatever. I was just very impressed with how she remained such an important and significant force in Singapore and Malaysia, when she had lost a lot of her ritual. There are very few temples to her, there are very few cults to her, very few little worship to her. And she's many ways been thoroughly Sanskritized in the cities, right? So I was very interested in how they've managed to preserve some of the things that make her less generic, very distinct and specific. So I didn't really concentrate so much on caste. I mean, caste definitely significant, but I was much more concerned with the sort of how she'd been able to retain her force in Singapore in some ways, which she hasn't been able to in Tamil Nadu.
Thank you. Thanks, Indira. Any questions from anyone else in the room? Please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask. Yeah. Jim Sykes.
Hello, thank you so much for this talk. This is just fantastic. I learned so much. Thank you so much. You started answering my questions at the end, because the first question I had was, I was thinking of Anita Singha's work, of course, on Munisvar, and then I was thinking sort of like, how do we view Periyachi within a sort of, unified Singaporean Hinduism? So you've already started to answer that, but I'd be interested to hear a little bit more. Obviously the issue of gender is sort of, and childbirth is what really makes her unique. But I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit more about, like, is there something about the sort of tendencies that you see in Periyachi worship? Are they actually similar in some ways to what we would find in Munisvar and with sort of other diasporic transformations of Hinduism? So I guess the first question is, you already started to do this, just elaborate a little bit more on what's making sort of Singaporean Hinduism unique here. But the second question was, I was very interested in the issue of meat, because I know that in Malaysia, there's certain temples that are famous for ecstatic worship, right? So I'm thinking of the Kaliaman temple in Muar and in Johor, which, where people will go, because they're, particularly when it comes to meat offerings, they're considered, a better place for that, right? So I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on the different Periyachi temples in Malaysia, if you've done any research on this yet there, sort of how those compare to the ones in Singapore, and are they actually attracting Singaporeans to those temples? I'll just add on a sort of a brief addendum that I know there's a Periyachi temple in Penang, for instance, and I was wondering, is there something about the port cities that when the laborers came back in the day, because childbirth was a lot more dangerous, that they built these temples in the port cities, and does that sort of remain a sort of a heartland, so to speak, for Periyachi, or in recent years have they actually just spread all throughout the Malay, peninsula? So those are the types of questions I'm thinking about. Again, thank you for the talk.
Oh, thank you. And obviously, Vinita is a huge inspiration, right? She started looking at these sorts of diasporic deities in a very serious manner, and I've always been inspired by her work, and so it builds upon her work and looking at what other deities are important or significant in Singapore, and not so prominent in Tamil Nadu, where they're supposed to originate from and where they're supposed to come from. So how have they developed in Singapore as opposed and they've lost significance there. So it's not like all mother goddesses, right? So like Angala Parameswari, Mariamman, all of these are village goddesses, and they continue to be very popular in Tamil Nadu. But Periyachi herself was distinctive because of the lack of visibility of her in Tamil Nadu. And I was only able to do that because I had done fieldwork in Tamil Nadu. If I hadn't, I would just think everyone in Tamil Nadu worships the thing. Similarly with things like Taipusam, for example. It's a huge deal in Singapore and Malaysia, but it's not at all in Tamil Nadu. So you would have like Panguni Uttram would be important, right? But not so much Taipusam or in the way that we have. And part of the work involves trying to decipher why Singaporeans are so attached to these particular goddesses. And I think if you trace where these goddesses come from, you can trace migration from there. So they brought their gods and goddesses to here. So something like Veerama Kaliamman, which is a very important temple in Serangoon Road in Little India in Singapore, it comes from a specific region called Pudukkottai. So a lot of people migrated from Pudukkottai to Singapore, and therefore we have Veerama Kaliamman temple. So the one way in which you feel at home in places is, of course, you bring your gods with you. And, you know, that is one thing familiar in this new and alien sort of place. So, you know, Periyachi comes from around the region of Chennai. So obviously that has some roots to it. But I think it's her distinctive associations with midwifery that renders her very, very, very significant, right? And I'm still trying to tease out why, you know, because obviously usually only males migrate, right? And so obviously you didn't need these goddesses for a very long time. So it's only when women came and they stopped being sojourners and tried to settle down that these sorts of gods and goddesses became very important. So if you look in Singaporean temples, they would have, you know, a Murugan or a Vishnu or whatever, and then they would have by the side Sangali Karuppan and Veeranar and all of that. So they try to combine this, what usually is not combined in India, right? So all these sort of minor village meat-eating deities who are now rendered vegetarian, of course, with these major sensitive gods as well. So it's a sort of collection that the countries, depending on their various interests and all that. So I think this disparity itself, this coming together of what is usually kept separate, is what is interesting about Hinduism in Singapore in many ways. So the meat-eating being part of it. So firewalking is an important festival in Mariamman Temple in Singapore. When it first began, and we have videos in the 18th century and everything, there was a goat that was sacrificed, right? Before they ever descended into the pit. And now, no such, is completely vegetarianized, right? And so these sort of discrepancies and juxtapositions, which are unusual, that only take root in a diasporic space, I think that's what makes it distinctively Singaporean. And I've not done enough work in Malaysia to make a strident or strict comparison, but I've noticed this older version of Periyachi being more visible in Malaysia than they are here, right? Here you largely have the fierce manifestation. So I obviously need to do more fieldwork in order to try to answer that question. And in terms of meat, I mean, I think that the gods who eat the things that you eat are our ancestors and kin and close to you. So especially for like, you know, intermediate caste or lower caste kind of thing, right? Your gods eat what you eat. You eat meat, your gods eat meat. That's the most valuable thing that you can offer to your gods, right? So this vegetarianism actually renders these gods quite distant and quite, since a lot, I mean, in Tamil Nadu, 93% of the population is non-vegetarian. And so the closer you are, the more affinity and the more kinship you have with the gods, the more likely they are to eat. And so this imposition of vegetarianism actually distances them, renders them much more abstract, much more generic, and much less specific and intimate with you. That's my sort of speculation about that meat.
Any other questions? Anyone? I will ask another and maybe give you guys time if you do have another question. So so maybe I have a bias for my foster mother, and that makes me reluctant to think that she is immobilized to you. But would it be possible to think that she retains some mobility despite the physical lack of space in Singapore compared to India because she moves between Singapore and Malaysia, as you have pointed out, where she is more regularly, and again, to use your terms, activated and animated by the people who worship her. And so I just came across this phrase in Vinita Sinha's book, Temple Tracks, right? She says, a continuous ethnographic space. So to think about it in that context, because I think that might give us more to, think about this particular goddess and her worship. And one comment about the aged look, I think you're right. I mean, yes, Malaysia, but in the context of Singapore, I have seen it, but it's always not in a public temple. Like it's either in a forest temple, like a Katukoil, on home shrines, in those contexts, and maybe that speaks to something that maybe you know more about, you can comment on.
So yes, there's, I mean, obviously, I don't want to make this very stark kind of thing that she isn't able to move. So this is why I gave this contrasting where she possesses, in the middle of a temple ritual, she possesses organically a woman there. So she can, but the sort of degree of freedom seems to be circumscribed. And this is partly because of the institutionalization, the sort of iconography, the ritualization itself, the very ways in which she is used to worship and she is mediated renders her in that form. So the ritual itself, but she can escape the ritual sometimes, right? But I think while I agree with Vinita, this is a continuous ethnographic space. Nevertheless, in Singapore, the space to move is much less, right? You have a lot more free, and this is why a lot of Singaporeans do not do Thaipusam in Singapore anymore, because they find it so circumscribed by laws and regulation and traffic and all of that, that the sort of essence of it, the sort of fun of it is lost, and they prefer to go to Malaysia, where there are less intrusion and penetration of the state into their everyday sort of ritual activities. They're left to themselves a lot more. I think the laws and the regulations and all of that is much more prominent here. So while it is a continuous space, it is not the same space, right? She's not allowed to move as she is in Malaysia, in Singapore, right? And because it's a multicultural space, a multi-religious space, and a thoroughly urban space, and you're competing for attention with several other gods, and you are, being sort of enmeshed within all of these rules and regulations of what time, when, what's amount of noise, where can you move. You can just go outside your temple, that's it, right? And then you have to go back in, right? You can't, you can't just stride around as you would. And very few jungle spaces left, or so whatever they are, they will soon become condominiums anyway, right? So I think the sort of, in terms of the oversight of the state and the laws and the presence of the laws and the regulations, there is an infringement on how free people are to practice their religion, and in the same sense how they imagine their gods to move around.
I think we have Shazwani and Theran who have questions. Who wants to go first?
Theran, you can go ahead first.
Oh, no, Shazwani, please. Please, no, Shazwani. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for the very wonderful and very fascinating talk. And it's actually quite refreshing to hear about things that are happening back home. I actually have a question around the secrecy that you were talking about, around Periyachi. And of course, I'm again coming from a place where I'm also thinking through with my research. So, like, I was wondering, this secrecy around Periyachi that is bounded by gender, and as you mentioned, the sacredness of these ritual practices that seek to, exclude men. And I think you alluded to this in your talk, but I also wonder if you can talk more about what this may reveal about the gender dynamics of the Tamil community in Singapore. Yeah, just a question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. In some ways, it mirrors the gender dynamics, right? So in many ways, women are considered to be associated and primarily responsible for childbirth, childcare, caregiving and all of that. So in some ways, it mirrors that. It doesn't challenge that. The way that ritually, at least, I find it to be a radical notion, right? Because a lot of rituals in some ways deny women's significance in any way, right? And because these are rituals concocted by men, for men, by men, through men, whatever, right? And so this is why explicitly compared them with sacrifices, which are also fertility rituals, which are asking for children and all of that, by thoroughly excluding women. But not just excluding women, but denigrating them, in fact, symbolically sacrificing them, that they are totally insignificant to things. And this is a counterfactual assertion, right? So where this is radical is that it centers women's concerns and centers women's capacities. And it says that you cannot ignore women in terms of when you talk about fertility or reproduction, that it is only through women's bodies and labors that you get babies and that you thing. So it is only radical within the ritual context, not in terms of gender dynamics so that's why I'm very careful about gender biological determinism, right? Because it seems to mirror the gender divisions that have been part of what we are familiar with for such a long time, right? But within the ritual space, right, in terms of how women's capacities are appropriated through ritual by men, then this is a radical assertion. So it's a limited radical kind of thing. It's not it doesn't overthrow anything. Very few rituals are, completely overthrow these kinds of associations. So in a way, it makes space for women and their concerns and their preoccupations and their skills and capacities. And I think it's important and significant and interesting precisely because of that.
Hi Indra. So
Hello.
Hello. Nice to see you again up here.
Nice to see you again.
It's such a wonderful talk. Always a treat to listen to, and
Thank you.
just with two very very facile questions. One follows up from what Praveen asked also, kind of. So I'm just when I was thinking, one Periyachi Amman temple that I was quite familiar with when I was still in Singapore was in Pasir Gudang in Johor. And I used to go there quite a bit. And one of the things there was that it started off as a kind of Kadakovil, small one, and the area developed. The more the area developed, the bigger the temple became. Because one of the things was that with the development, the fact that the worship continued, miracle stories continued, she developed. So this was really like following on Praveen's question, kind of, and your responses. One of the things I was thinking was also probably quite distinctive about Periyachi is that while she seems immobilized by the lack of space, maybe the lack of space and in aggrandizing urban development in Singapore, as you heard, is what is crucial to her development as such an important figure. So the lack of space creates a lot of space for her. I don't know whether I'm making any sense or not, but that's kind of. And the second question is also one of the things that's always struck me is and again anecdotally with Singaporeans, Malaysians traveling and be it with Sufi shrines in Tamil Nadu or South Indian shrines all over, be it the Caribbean. So with Singaporeans, Malaysians traveling, they bring what's from Singapore, Malaysia there, and we find a kind of Singaporean Islam going there. I mean, I'm seeing like even here in the US, some Singaporean Malaysian families have brought this Periyachi Amman here. So you have these small Periyachi Amman groups here, etc. I'm wondering whether there's anything like that going on in Tamil Nadu, because I know it was a very minor deity, but is there something going back that way?
I think that's a very interesting thing to think about, because maybe her constriction within a space intensifies the devotion and intensifies. So in that sense, it sort of distills and concentrates that she becomes this important, she remains an important. So that's something for me to think about a lot more. Maybe she's not becoming more popular, but she's, internally in becoming much more deeper and more ensconced within Singaporean kind of hearts and minds and things like that. I mean, I would really like to think about it. As far as that, as in the sort of traffic between Singapore and Tamil Nadu, in terms of rituals, I find that a lot of Singaporeans are going back and reviving their lineage or ancestral sort of deities, building temples, contributing to this sort of Sanskritization in some ways of their ancestral gods. So, it's usually provoked by an astrologer saying you are having all these problems because you are ignoring your ancestral god. You are worshipping all these other gods, but your original god, you're not. So they go back and do that. But apart from that, they don't seem to be sort of exporting back to Singapore any sort of ritual. I mean, the Taoists and the Chinese are doing that back in China because of the Cultural Revolution. They lost a lot of these theology and ritual skills and ritual specialists. So Singapore is importing, and even in terms of Christianity, yes, because like Joseph Prince and people like that are importing charismatic Christianity back to the US. But I think in here, perhaps the community is much too small as yet to actually have an impact. But beyond this sort of renovating and reviving these sort of ancestral gods, I haven't encountered any bringing their gods to there yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any other questions from anyone? I can go on talking or asking about this because it's very fascinating, and there's like barely any work on Periyachi worship in the Tamil diaspora in Singapore and Malaysia. So a thought that, well, came to mind is in relation to the public, private, and gender. And so temple worship of Periyachi, which you spoke elaborately about it being vegetarian, being managed by men. But how about thinking about this temple worship as something that's public facing and so maintains an outlook that keeps in line with the country's outlook in relation to a very Brahmanized Hinduism, right? Which is what the country also promotes and maintains. And maybe it's possible to suggest that this outlook is maintained by the community, and it's more so, it's a performed compliance maybe to maintain this outlook, just to maintain one's presence in Singapore as a minority community that's also often overlooked. And instead, Periyachi lives at home and with the people where she is correctly worshipped by the rightful preceptors, and that's women, right? Yeah.
I think that's the conclusion that I'm drawing in many ways, in the sense that where she is most free is when where she is in the home and amongst women and I mean, more than, I mean, the circumscriptions and all of that she's subject to in the temples, and because of what you want to portray in a multi-religious kind of, as a minority in a multi-religious kind of situation. Where she's free is when she sort of enters into homes and into women, and because spontaneously she tends to possess women much more than men anyway. So men have to go through a lot of effort to manifest her in terms of costuming, in terms of rituals, in terms of dancing, in terms of austerities, in terms of all of that. They have to go through a whole hullabaloo in order to. But women barely do anything, barely represent her, barely just do what they normally do: cook, eat, have look after children and all of that, and she is manifest in them. And in an amplified and sort of enlarged sort of manner. So this sort of effortful aspect of it is what you see in the temples, right? With interspersed sometimes by this organic possession, but the sort of spontaneous, organic, kind of very simplified kind of thing. And this sort of echoes how she is in the villages as well. Minimal ritual syntax, minimal representation, and yet free to come and go and be wherever she wants at will. Right. So I think the homes in Singapore sort of echo her origins much more. Even the origins that are echoed in the temples, you have to put all these stalks of palm trees and coconut palms and all of that, and create this arboreal kind of bower. But, she's much more at home in this very simple kind of amongst women kind of situation. Yeah.
Thank you, Indira. Any last questions, comments that you'd like to share with our speaker? This is
if I might just...
Yes, Amy, please.
Yeah. If I might just make a comment, I've listened with great interest, Indira. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's fabulous, and it's lovely to think about these topics with you. Really enjoyed it. Your last comments in response to Praveen's question made me think about Joyce Flickiger's other work on Gangama, her aesthetics of excess, and what you're describing there about men donning Vaisham to experience temporary embodiment of the goddess versus women's everyday kind of commensality with the goddess is very much her argument there. And, their inability to look at her Ugra nature, her Ugra iconography, men's, versus women's, shared essence with her across, time and space that's outside of the Jatra period. So yeah, there's a really nice sort of complementarity between some of the things you're saying here and some of the things she's presented there. So yeah, this fits and fills out, a body of goddess scholarship that we just don't have. And I love to hear you talk about this. So thanks so much for presenting, and thanks so much also to the SEAG group for convening.
Thank you so much, Amy. Always lovely to hear from you. And yes, Joyce is a hugely important inspiration for helping me think through many of these issues. Now I just have to find a way to say something that Joyce hasn't already said.
As her graduate student, I think that's a significant problem that we share.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
I would love to hear the both of you speak together on a panel about this, because of the overlaps with Angala Parameshwari worship and how this also begins to conflate, or is also a part of Periyachi worship. But I think that's another event that we will have to host. But any other...
Let's do it.
Yeah. Any other closing questions, comments from anyone in the room? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Indira, for a wonderful talk. And for the great conversation that we all just had. And thank you, everyone, for attending. We have another event coming up. It's an in-person event. It's by none other than Professor Vinita Sinha, who will be speaking at UPenn on the 18th of April. Follow us on our Instagram page for more information. But otherwise, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Have a great night. Good night, Indira, and have a great day, everyone else in North America. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the wonderful, provocative, productive questions that you've asked me. It gave me a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.